Either cars are getting less expensive to own, which is unlikely, or people are fundamentally misunderstanding their own costs of ownership. There's a scene in the movie Ocean's 11 where George Clooney's character is speaking to Brad Pitt, and he's trying to justify this risk that he wants him to take, and the justification that he uses is that the house always wins. He says, if you play long enough and you never change the stakes, the house takes you. And certainly that applies to the casino gambling industry, but it also applies in a lot of ways to buying and owning cars, particularly exotic cars. And we talk a lot about great buys and great ownerships and great flips and ways you can make money owning cars. And yes, those cases are valid, they're all true, and those are great things that you can aspire to. But in the aggregate, in the long term, when you own cars like this, they cost potentially an awful lot of money, and there's a fundamental lack of understanding of what true cost of ownership is. Whether it's per mile, per month, per year, per car, whatever the case, however you want to evaluate it, it does cost money. And even though we can find these microcosms and these minuscule examples of times where you make money, in general, in the aggregate and over time, it's expensive. And what I wanted to talk about today is a little bit of how I used to evaluate cost per mile of ownership, because as an exotic car rental company, you do sort of become hyper conscious to this idea of what the cars are costing you, because I have to evaluate profitability based on the revenue that comes in, but also over the expenses that I have to anticipate. Because I might make a lot of money today and have to spend a lot of it tomorrow, and hopefully it's not more than I just made. But as I evaluate sort of setting up money for the anticipated expenses based on consumption and lifespan, I really have to look at whether or not this is a profitable endeavor. And as I would look out and kind of survey what it was going to cost me to own these cars, I recognized early on that there's a few things that I have to account for that people don't necessarily think of as they go in and buy a car. And the first is really the cost of the money. Because it doesn't matter if it's interest on a car loan or just not having the money invested elsewhere, having money tied up in an expensive asset costs a lot of money. And so I would look at 4 to 6% in most cases as what it was costing me to have the car. And back then interest rates were a little higher, maybe 7, 8% occasionally, particularly for a rental type purpose. But it doesn't matter if it's 2.9%, it still costs you something today. And in a time lately where the market returns 10 to 15% sometimes per year, that's a huge cost of money that you really have to recognize and say, well, is it worth missing out on this opportunity in order to have this thing that I enjoy? Also, you've got depreciation. And that's one of the most misunderstood facets of exotic car ownership, because we talk about and look at a lot of examples of cars going up or flip opportunities, or at least older cars where the depreciation is either slowed down or potentially turned around into appreciation. But if you talk to people who have owned reasonably new cars in the aggregate, in the long term, most of them will tell you that it costs them about 1% per month. And this is sort of justified by the residuals that you'll see manufacturers put on cars. I mean, if you see a lease where the residual is less depreciation than 1% a month, in most cases, that's a pretty good deal on a lease. I mean, that's like a 911 or BMW 3 Series type residual. But even as we see some examples of these blue chip investment exotics, most of these cars like 250 GTOs or 300 SLs or Aston DB5s that are perpetually going up right now, most of them don't actually beat the stock market. I mean, the 250 GTO, yes, you could have bought one for $6,000 or $7,000 or $8,000 back then, and it's $50 million now, but you could have bought a lot of stocks back then that would be worth about the same. And you didn't buy those, and that's okay. But as you look at buying one today, that is really the only car that on a long-term basis has beaten the stock market. So as an investment, it may not become expensive, but there is still a cost relative to more traditional investments. Obviously, maintenance is really the monster in the closet of exotic car ownership for most people who are looking at this as a prospect. And yes, there's expensive maintenance schedules. I mean, oil changes are $250 to $500, and an annual service that wraps in a few other things might be $1,000 or $1,500 on a Ferrari, Lamborghini, McLaren, Aston, Bentley, whatever you're looking at. And you have to anticipate that, but usually there are bigger expenses like valve adjustments or timing belt replacement or something like that that comes up every 3 to 5 years that you might end up sort of holding the hot potato and having happen. And even if you look at your ownership window of a car to say that, well, I'm going to avoid these things because either they were just done or I'm not going to have to do them before I sell it, most people want a car that's been properly maintained. And if you do, you still may not avoid just the maintenance and service expenses that are kind of consumable or random. Things break on cars. I mean, this week I had to spend $4,000 on a used differential for my Murcielago. A new one was $14,000. I was able to minimize that expense by finding a good used part, but it still was something I wasn't looking for and expecting, but I knew that it kind of goes with the territory. You can have some very expensive things that we may or may not anticipate, but that do happen, and you kind of have to look at it, well, you know, I'm either dodging these expenses on kind of a random chance basis, but the odds are going to catch up with me at some point. And for me, I've done well. I've made good money flipping cars and owning cars inexpensively, but I recognize that at some points, sometimes these things are just going to happen. And if you look at these things as, you know, on a per mile basis, most of them are unavoidable on a per time basis. So the number of miles you drive definitely influences how much it costs you per mile. And if the government will let you, write off 50, 60 cents per mile on a car, we're talking about an entirely different paradigm with these cars. Because as I was evaluating my cost of ownership for the rental company, in general it kind of gravitated towards about $5.70 per mile. And when you say that, when you think about like a 10-mile drive costing you $50 or $60, that sounds crazy, but it's not. Because if you look at not only the time value of the money and the depreciation and the maintenance and the service, you've also got the consumables that are easy to anticipate: gas, tires, clutches, things like that. They do add up. And I mean, a $2,000 set of tires is a fairly small line item on what it could cost you to maintain a Lamborghini. But if they only last 8 or 10,000 miles, that's still about 20 cents per mile for tires. And if you have a $3 gallon of gas that only gets you 8 or 10 miles, that's another 30 or more cents per mile. So you're at what the government thinks cars cost with just 2 consumable items, not to mention the fact that you have these clocks ticking on all these other items. And so it really did play out that way, but mostly because I was owning these cars through the consumable life of these parts. I was doing multiple clutches, multiple sets of brakes, multiple things like that. And I always recognized that I needed to have in revenue as close to 1% of a car's value per day that it was rented out in order to know that I was going to be profitable. And that was on a shoestring budget, minimized expenses, running things as lean as I possibly could. When you start looking at big marketing and big staffs and things like that, you have to make a lot of money. And the exotic car rental industry today is not allowing that type of revenue. If you look at the rates that are available in the marketplace today, that certainly isn't reflected. So either cars are getting less expensive to own, which is unlikely, or people are fundamentally misunderstanding their own costs of ownership. And that was pretty frequent because I would get approached all the time by people who wanted help making their exotic car payments and asking me to rent them out and split the revenue, who didn't understand the other expenses are going to eat them alive as we put miles on their car. But also we have things like Turo today, which is a great peer-to-peer car rental site where I can rent my car to you if I so choose. And if you look at the rates that people are asking on their own accord, evaluating what they think it costs people to drive their cars, the numbers are insanely low. And that means that in most rental markets, if you were to offer a fleet of exotic cars for rent, you'd be priced out of the marketplace by people who just don't understand what they're doing wrong. And that's sometimes what these peer-to-peer sites, there's a lot of Uber drivers that don't understand what their car is costing them to operate that aren't actually making money, they're just generating revenue. And if you're out there seeing cars that are available for rent, even from reputable companies, because a lot of marketplaces have these kind of car shared arrangements where people are renting out 458s for $600 or $700 a day. I know Rob Ferretti's talked a lot about what he sees the rental car market becoming, because he'll go to places and rent a car for really cheap, and maybe it's beat up in a terrible example, but when you drive it down Las Vegas Boulevard, everybody thinks you're a celebrity, and so nobody really cares. But even with these cars on Turo, you'll see i8s and Aston Martins and Gallardos and 430s and cars that are $150,000 for rent for $400 a day. And you are losing money every time you rent a car at that kind of price, but people do it all day. There's hundreds of examples, and we even see them categorized on VINwiki of interesting cars that are available on Turo. And I look at them all and I go, goodness gracious, these people are losing so much money by letting people rent their cars out, not only in the wear and tear, but in just the consumable things that obviously they don't think they're going to end up having to pay. A 10, 15-year-old car isn't really depreciating, but is it becoming more expensive to service? Absolutely. And so if you were looking at whether or not you could come into a market and say, well, can I rent exotic cars out for this amount of money? In most cases now the answer is no, because someone who can't do math as well as they need to is renting their car out for less than they ought to. And it's important for us to look at it because the dream of owning an exotic car is a great one. It's an awesome goal, and relative to a lot of other things, boats, planes, crazy travel, it's a pretty inexpensive hobby, and it's rewarding, and there are ways that you can minimize and avoid some expenses. But if you own them long enough, even if it's not the same car, if you own enough cars long enough, it's going to cost you something. It's a reasonable amount of money. It's worth it. I love it. We enjoy it. But you need to go into it eyes open and really look at what it's going to be, because eventually the house does win, the odds catch up to you, and you have to buy something that's expensive for it. But you know what you get to do the next day? Put it into gear and blast it down the highway.